the Holocaust. Over the course, over the course of 2 years of basically instituting these best practices and guidelines, which should be available sometime early this summer. First of all, teachers and schools and districts will be expected to adhere to those best practices and guidelines beginning this fall. And after about 2 years or so, the OSPI and the Holocaust Center will sit down again, we'll look at data, and we will evaluate at that time to make sure that, to see whether or not teaching about the Holocaust becomes mandatory. Now, excuse me. Now, teaching about the Holocaust, importantly, has never just been about teaching for history's sake. So importantly, you know, our name itself sort of bears the idea in mind that it's a Holocaust Center for Humanity, and it's really been about teaching the lessons of the Holocaust. And the legislature clearly recognized this when you can see sort of in that quote there that I put there, that in addition to this study being a reaffirmation to never again permit such occurrences, studying this material is intended to examine the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and intolerance, and prepare students to be responsible citizens in a pluralistic democracy. In addition to this, I mentioned to you about the guidelines that we're developing. One of the guidelines specifically refers to using the lessons of the Holocaust as a platform for life lessons. And I want to quote one part from that, from the guideline, and it says this: "Despite the hope of never again, other genocides have occurred and continue to occur since 1945. Hatred in the form of bullying and otherwise is widely prevalent. Teaching students about the Holocaust and other genocides is so often disheartening for them. When teachers use these lessons as springboards for promoting awareness, inclusion, empathy, and tolerance advocacy, they help students realize their potential places not as helpless, but as agents for change, as upstanders." So now I want to, I guess, tell you a little bit about myself so that you understand where I came from in my journey, because I think it's illustrative really of the why as well. So I am originally from the Midwest. Both of my parents are European immigrants, my father from Belgium and my mom from Italy. And I originally was a lawyer for about 15 years and seeking a little more fulfillment, I think, in terms of the nature of what I was doing. I entered into a teaching program at Northwestern University in Chicago. And as a result of it, my first 3-4 years of teaching were in the inner city schools of Chicago. And specifically, my first one of my first gigs really was teaching on the far southeast side of Chicago. It was all Mexican first and second generation kids, gangland, high poverty, multiple families living in one place. And so here I was going to be teaching 8th grade. And I was like, holy cow, I mean, what am I going to use as an ELA teacher? What's going to connect with students? And one teacher, I was sort of polling a bunch of teachers that I knew and thought very highly of at the time. One teacher recommended, hey, have you ever used the book or read the book Night? And I hadn't at that time. So I read it in that summer. And of course, it made a tremendous impact on me. I was moved, I was shaken. My dad had just passed away earlier that year. So I personally had so many connections, father, son, et cetera, et cetera. But I really wondered, how is this going to work with kids who aren't from that part of the world? And, you know, I just didn't know. But I decided to try it. So I learned as much as I could. And we started Night, I think, in the springtime. Unbelievably, I've never to this day seen any type of, to this day really, any lessons or unit that I've ever taught that has resonated more profoundly and more deeply with my students. These kids had myriad connections, things that I couldn't possibly anticipate. Family, choices, desperation, what would you do ifs, in terms of would you risk your life to hide somebody and things, and they were connecting it constantly to their friends and their neighbors and their background. And it really, I guess, pushed me into saying, I need to learn more, and can I bring in survivors and things like that? What can I do to help them so that we can make this a truly well-developed unit. And so over time, after teaching in Chicago for some years and Buffalo, New York for a couple of years in the inner city, then I was in Spokane, and then most recently Kent. And when I was teaching in Spokane, that's when I discovered the Holocaust Center for Humanity. And specifically, I was connected there with the Speakers Bureau and teaching trunks and so many resources that I didn't have and that my schools couldn't afford to buy, or I couldn't afford to buy on my own self without my wife's censure. um, it's really grown and blossomed over time, and then I've just sought out further knowledge and education, always with an eye towards making the best experience with my students, because as the guidelines and as SB 5612 indicated, it really has always been about trying to build kids who will stand up, who will recognize injustices, even in hallways, from bullying to hateful language towards people for their culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, it's been something that has resonated so deeply and has moved me to where I am now. And so last fall, late last summer, I came to work directly for the center, and the work has been tremendously rewarding. And I hope throughout the course of this session here that I'm able to show you some interesting and positive things here that can help you. Okay, so uh, moving right back here. There we go. Okay. So today in the agenda for today, I want to first go over the learning outcomes. Then, in other words, what I hope that you will walk away with by the end of today. And then I want to talk about the guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust. I mentioned them earlier, and it's very important to talk about them here today. In addition, I'll then get into some of the overview lessons by theme and chronology, participation in our writing and art contest, a quick recap of how what we've created applies, or the guidelines apply to them, and vice versa. Then I'll talk a little bit about additional learning resources and programs, and then take your questions. Okay, before I get into that though, I want to send out a poll here and just see what some of your goals are for today. So the first question here is, what is your level of familiarity with the Holocaust Center for Humanities Educational Resources? So if you could please answer that question. I just have 2 questions on this part. Awesome. So we have a real good mix. The majority knows about our center and our programs, but we have some first timers and several who have never used our resources. So thank you so much for coming. Like I say, I hope this is as interesting as possible. This is definitely unique times. Ordinarily, we'd be talking to you about our trunks and our speakers and things, but hopefully what we talk about today will help. Okay, and then the second question here, if I can pull that up, is, let's see here. What do you hope to learn in today's session? And you can click one of them, all of the above, or something else. Okay, so combination, the biggest combination is the lessons to share with the students remotely, and then several clicking all of the above. I guess that's the biggest one, and then additional programs as well. So thanks. Hopefully then, like I say, today should be helpful for you. Okay, so to get in here today, our learning outcomes are these. 1, I hope that by the end of this session that you will better understand how to introduce virtual lessons and activities of the Holocaust to your students. And number 2, that you will ascertain how these lessons and activities effectively meet guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust, the Common Core state standards, and importantly, satisfy the diverse equity needs and interests of your students. Okay, so here, as I mentioned earlier, I want to talk about the guidelines, and here's why. The guidelines would be important under any circumstance. Many, teachers at this point of the school year, many have told me that they were in the middle of their Holocaust unit and like, holy cow, what do I do? I mean, we sort of stopped right in the middle of it. Others were just about ready to start. And I know as a teacher, this being out of the classroom right now would be just absolutely devastating, because to me, everything that I had been teaching in a year would have cascaded towards lessons about the Holocaust. Because again, knowing where it's going to lead these, often eighth graders or sixth graders in the past, or young high school students, um, ultimately, I'm trying to build them towards something. I'm using the books and the texts and things to try to instill this sort of sense of I belong, I can do something, I have a voice. And so this would be devastating for me to be out of it. And so I don't think anything can possibly take the place of you being in the classroom with your students and the various lessons and the resources that could be given. However, what we've created here, I think, still is very not only valid and relevant, but still very helpful and extraordinarily powerful based on how we've done this, which you're going to see today. So quickly, I want to go through what some of these guidelines are. The first 10 of these here are basically the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's guidelines for teaching the Holocaust. When the best practices and guidelines come out, some teachers have already asked and said, hey, does that mean that we can only teach exactly what you're telling us to teach? Absolutely not. The best practices that we're developing comport with the guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust, and any lesson from any lesson that you develop, as long as you understand what these guidelines are, then then you can still be, teaching some of the lessons. And obviously, anytime there's a question, if this thing flies or should I use this book or not, feel free to contact us, and we can, either answer it ourselves or connect you with somebody who can. So the first idea here, importantly, you always want to establish a definition of the term the Holocaust. And that basically we want to place this history into geographical and temporal context. The second one, that the Holocaust was not inevitable. What that's really referring to is that the Holocaust took places because individuals, groups, and nations made decisions to act or not to act. So we want to make sure that lessons are able to show that thing. The Holocaust raises difficult questions about human behavior, and we want any lesson to be able to show and allow students to think about the many factors and events that contributed to the Holocaust and that made decision-making difficult and uncertain. The fourth one, precision of language. There's an easy temptation to generalize, and so we want to avoid big stereotypes and words that describe human behavior often have multiple meanings. Some people, for example, with the term resistance, they would think that it only means physical resistance, but in Lessons of the Holocaust, you would see that there were many forms of resistance. Avoiding comparisons of pain. I'll come back to the one before it in a second. It's an easy temptation to say, oh, the Holocaust was the worst thing that ever happened. Just like with today, some people keep on trying to make comparisons with COVID-19 and 9/11 and things like that. Loss is loss and pain is pain. And we want to make sure that we allow for and recognize people's individual and unique responses to times of crisis and awful things, period. Balancing the perspectives, usually, especially for those history teachers in our crowd today, we know that history is usually written by the conquerors and not the conquered, or not the vanquished. And so importantly, we want to make sure that we give voice to victims, people on the other side of the equation. So balancing perspectives, avoid romanticizing history. We want to make sure that we portray all individuals, including both victims and perpetrators, as human beings capable of moral judgment and independent decision-making. Contextualizing the history, again, we want to make sure that the history itself is established before delving into any specific texts. It's one of the biggest shortcomings that I see in some units of the Holocaust, where teachers will wind up getting straight into a text without really allowing for students to learn about the time and the situations that apply so that they can gain deeper meaning. Statistics into people. That's a huge one. It's almost impossible for the mind to conjure the number 6 million, let alone when you consider all other victims of the Holocaust and get into 11 million plus. Students can't conjure that. So you give voice to the 6 million when you tell individual stories and you introduce students into the individual people involved. And then methodological choices. Again, a fair, balanced perspective and overview of the lessons of the Holocaust are what is going to resonate so much. And then I already addressed the issue of using them as a platform for life lessons. So hopefully by the end of this, you will see how these lessons all apply. Okay, so now let's get into what some of these lessons are. Okay, so here are some lessons and activities that we've developed here. And, oops, sorry. Okay, so stop share, and I'm going to share it with this page right here. Okay, so here then are the recommended lessons that don't require a teacher. Once this part comes up. Okay, sorry for this pause here. All right, so these lessons, again, we talked about the importance of we tried to answer the call of hearing districts and OSPI's big commitment to trying to make sure that lessons would be equitable in recognizing the fact that many people don't have internet connectivity, they don't have internet or laptops at all. And I know that many of the public schools in and around our area are getting great donations and are doing great things in terms of getting into students' hands laptops and other type of access. But we wanted to make sure that you would have lessons that could also be printed and shared as a worst case scenario or as a backup plan. And so they take these into consideration. As you can see over here, we have overview lessons by subject. And all of these lessons will adhere to the Common Core state standards. So over here you can see we went through, and each of the lessons that you'll see that we have will apply to one or more of these, not only through ELA and informational text, but speaking and listening, literacy and history and social studies, and further, even the OSPI social studies, civics, and history standards as well. So you can feel free to access those in case you need to or want to see the justification for the lessons. And then after that, how we've organized these in 1 through 7 here is basically kind of how our Holocaust Center's museum is organized in terms of relative chronological organization from pre-war to liberation and post-war, but also thematic. I mean, there's obviously a lot of sort of crossover in terms of the chronology of, pre-war, changing world, et cetera. But in any case, so let's say that a teacher hadn't yet started the lessons. So what I would probably recommend is, you'll see down here, is beginning with what was the Holocaust. You could click this. It's an online article with critical thinking questions. I can come back to that later if you'd like. But let's take a look at what one of these looks like here, so you see that it's sort of short and sweet with video access of survivor clips as well. So right here on pre-war, very importantly in comporting with the guidelines, it's super important to make sure that we're not coming right in and students who lack context seeing that, okay, these Jews were victims from day one. We want to make
sure. I'm so sorry. Can I interrupt you for just a moment?
Sure.
We're not seeing your screen. We're just looking at the PowerPoint. Just wanted to let you know, there's been a few questions about it. Are you able to flip it over to the lessons?
Let me see. Hang on a second. You got it there?
That's it. Perfect.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Okay. So, okay, pre-war. So I'm so sorry. I thought I had the right slide there. So on pre-war, so again, just real quickly, we want to make sure that we establish that that Jews weren't victims from day one, because students just learning about it, they'd be like, okay, without really any context of the vibrancy of Jewish life. So you can take a look. This is a fairly short overview here. And I'll read this here just because I want to like put you sort of into the mode of seeing it as if you were a student. So Europe had a rich and diverse set of Jewish cultures that had existed for generations, in some areas for over 1,000 years. In 1933, approximately 9.5 million Jews lived in Europe, less than 2% of the total European population. The Jews of Eastern Europe lived predominantly in Jewish villages called shtetls. They wore traditional clothes, spoke Yiddish, and often kept to themselves. In Germany and Western Europe, Jews tended to assimilate. They lived in the cities, went to the same schools, and dressed and spoke like their non-Jewish neighbors. The roughly 500,000 Jews who lived in Germany made up less than 1% of the German population. More than 100,000 Jews had served in the German army during World War I, and some were decorated war heroes. Jews in Europe could be found in all walks of life: farmers, tailors, factory hands, accountants, doctors, teachers, artists, and business owners, to name a few. Some families were wealthy, many more were poor. More than 60% of the world's Jewish population lived in Europe at the time, and in little more than a decade, 2 out of every 3 of them would be dead, killed during the Holocaust. So again, so you have sort of a short, compact history, very short, provided there, but then in order to give it depth, we have some survivor video clips. I think in this case, there are 4 of them. And you'll notice 2 things. One is that a student who has internet capability and access could click any one of the links and see that video clip. Each of them are 1.5 minutes to 2.5 minutes long. And regardless of whether they have access, you could easily print and share. We've also made sure that there is a transcript of what the survivor said. So I'm going to show you one of these right now. I'm going to show you Noemi Bond. She passed away, sadly, just this past year. And I'll click this so you can see.
I had the most wonderful, secure, happy childhood. Whatever part I remember, I have to smile. I feel the warmth of it till now as I'm talking about it.
Can you describe your relationship between your mother and father?
Absolutely loving, supporting each other, and true happiness. And I guess so that's what it's carried over to me. Later on at schools, the 4 elementary school was in my father's school. As I told you, he was my principal and teacher in 4th grade. And he was so strict, but I learned a lot. My father was a teacher, so every single summer we went on vacation, where he met all his colleagues, and we met their children. And it was a joyful, wonderful way of being together in the summer. We took hikes. I learned how to swim. I learned how to paddle, whatever, in the boat, ship, or canoe. Yeah. But many little bitty things, which was very valuable, very precious. But I still remember that even then, when we were on vacation, I had to practice the piano. It is a good memory now. Then it was not so good. My father took his violin and accompanied me while I was playing the piano. Later, when we get there in my story, I will refer to that.
Okay, so honestly, every time I was fortunate enough that Noemi was able to come and speak to my students a few years ago, back when I was in Spokane, and boy, oh boy, do the students and families still talk about her visit, still to this day, to me and to pretty much anybody from what I understand. So again, what's so great there is that in this way, especially when you think back about the guidelines and giving voice and sort of to me, this paints the picture. You have words, you have the little history, but then obviously the survivor video clips bring the story to life and give it depth. So then at the bottom here, there are questions right here. And each of these are critical thinking questions, so teachers could use them. Again, I don't know how you're doing it, whether you might be conducting these lessons virtually and online, where you then could have a discussion time. The other option, of course, is to assign one or more of the questions and have students write responses and then maybe send them to you. Some of them refer to the text and sort of get into like relating you, the student, to the issues that are addressed in the text. And of course, at least one or two in each of the sections refer to the video testimony. So hopefully you can see that that bears great potential that you can use as is. Now, one other thing that I want to mention, because I know I used to do this too, is that certainly when in a year where we'd be preparing for the state testing, the SBA, often we would sort of create questions using the sort of SBA question stems. And so anyone who needs their questions to be that way or would like more of them that way, if you want to like assign them as written things and look at them with Common Core questions in mind, feel free to inform me, and I can either do some of them with you or help you or show you how I do those, because I know I probably would do that with some of the questions in this situation. Okay, so that's pre-war. And so then going back to the page that preceded it, the sort of list of all of our lessons. Sorry, just waiting on this to flip back again. There we go. So again, we saw it goes to pre-war, changing world, flight and rescue, ghettos and camps, liberation and post-war, resistance, and then enduring lessons. So again, we have the whole thing. In the resistance here, I wanted to show you one video clip here. And this is of, so again, you see you have the text, examples of non-Jewish resistance. So in this way, students would understand that it wasn't just physical, but also cultural and religious resistance, including even preserving artifacts and things to preserve their lives and the story of Jewish life during this era. And then you have these survivor clips here. Thomas Blatt, who rebelled in the Sobibor death camp. Ed Kay, who became a partisan, and then we have two others here, Pete Metzeler and Martin Metzen. And then again, just like I showed you before, we have questions at the bottom, and one of them at least addressing the issue of, relating yourself to the issue of resistance and the difficulty of making that choice from, as Ed Kay says, that's why, you know what, I think I am going to show it here. Because it relates to the issue of like, this was, to him, he knew no other way, but he came very sort of almost defiant about this idea that all Jews went like lambs to the slaughter, because to him, everyone rebelled and resisted in their own way. All right, well, I want to move along here actually though, because if I can, there we go. So we have a couple more parts on this page here. One is we have a 20-minute film. You can access that by clicking this link here. And this film, With My Own Eyes, is an award-winning film, and it was developed by the center several years ago. And it does a tremendous job really in two ways. One, in terms of sort of introducing what the Holocaust was and some of the key figures and statistics, definition, and key terms. But in addition to that, it connects students with several of the local survivors of the Holocaust who ultimately settled in Washington State. And their testimony and what they talk about connects right into the idea of, as many students ask when they're learning about this subject, why are we learning about this? And right away, some of the survivors specifically refer to that it begins with bullying, it begins with prejudice and hate in schools, and it's those things unchecked that ultimately can lead and did lead up to something like the Holocaust. So for teachers or students who are looking for more of a deeper dive here, we have additional lessons that they can access here. As I said before, what was the Holocaust, in case you need to start right from the beginning with the definition. Each of these have questions. Anyone who is going to be moving their students into something like Anne Frank, I think it's important to give this context here about life in shadows, hidden children, and the Holocaust. And again, you can take a look at any of these, or if there's something that you don't see there that you wish you had, and if you need help in finding or accessing these things, please just say so. Okay, so hopefully this overall gives you a decent idea of what some of these lessons and activities are that don't necessarily require a teacher. Okay, so now moving back. So those lessons there would show you the guidelines. The lessons that we just talked about already, you can see that virtually every one of these has been connected in terms of definition of the term, in terms of giving individual stories and lives. But perhaps the strongest one of them all is relates to the issue of the writing and art contest. So I'm going to show you that really quickly, because if I was so the one thing that if you just did the lessons that we talked about there, the one thing that it doesn't necessarily get the students into is to probably the most important part, which is to reflect upon their learning and internalize it into what it means to them and what maybe they think about it and what they can hopefully or will do about it, or will do about issues of hate and prejudice, et cetera, discrimination that they see even in their daily lives. So anytime that I've taught about the Holocaust, it's always sort of cascaded into the participation in the writing, art, and film contest. So here this year, we have 2 different prompts. And again, this still can be done remotely. In fact, there's a teacher, because this is open, as you saw a little above here, this is open to teachers and students in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. And there's one teacher I know in Portland, Oregon. I think she's had about 30 of her students create entries in every possible way: art, film, and the different forms of writing that we have here. So this could also be done remotely by simply printing these things out. But of course, the ideal scenario would be that they use our Survivor Encyclopedia, which I'll show you briefly, and then that would allow them to make a choice. And it could be teacher directed. I know that if I was in the classroom this year, it seems like every single time around this time of year, the form of writing that we were bound to teach was argumentative. So now we have an argumentative prompt as well. And so therefore I would be able to teach argumentative writing, use a rubric that you'll see is included right here in our resources. There are additional resources that students can use, and then they would write it. I could assess it, and then each of the student entries could be entered into the contest itself. So you have the 2 options. One of them is creative, and that would allow for explanatory, narrative, or poetry. And basically there the prompt is that they would look at our Survivor Encyclopedia, pick any one of the survivors, any part of their story or their survivor period, and then talk about what their testimony, how it impacts, affects, or inspires them. And that is a tremendous thing. Already there have been several entries made in that category, and I'm really blown away by the depth of student thinking and creativity in that regard. And then, as I was saying before with argumentative, here you have, not that Governor Inslee has anything else to do at this point of the year, but here the students would be basically taking a look at the Survivor Encyclopedia, and then based on what they've learned, write an argumentative piece explaining or trying to persuade Governor Inslee into why teaching and learning about the Holocaust should be mandated in all schools in Washington. And so what that would require is the analysis of why it should be taught, and then they would refer to 3 or more credible sources And one of these sources should be the local survivor story from the Survivor Encyclopedia. Now, before I jump into the encyclopedia and leave this particular page, I want to show you that everything that the students would need is right on this page. First of all, they can submit their entry online by clicking there, or else they can download and print the entry form. You have rubrics for any of the forms of writing there, including the poetry rubric. And then there are all these resources, including taking a look at the 2019 winners. I always would do that with my students because it was very important for me to sort of say, this is the bar, these are the, I'm trying to teach competition, and this is what you're shooting for here. So take a look at the depth of the writing, take a look at the depth of the art, the style of art and things, and let's really go for it. And when I set that kind of bar, it's really prompted some incredibly powerful pieces throughout the years of me as a teacher. And then importantly, we don't want kids just to like go all over the internet, and anytime they click Holocaust, you're going to get all kinds of things, and some of them not so good, both in terms of graphic imagery and then in terms of certain hate groups and things like that who are putting out things that are denial, etc. And so we have vetted these resources that to build the argument, if they're writing the argumentative piece, they can click out any one or more of these, and any one or more of those then could also be used as fuel for why the Holocaust should be taught. Now, I want to show you really quickly, for those who are unaware, as I'm going back up to the top of the page, the Survivor Encyclopedia, because again, this is the base essentially of it all. And so remembering back to the guidelines and how the guideline referred to this idea that we want to make sure that we translate statistics into people. So our Survivor Encyclopedia tallies together, there we go, tallies together a number of local survivors, people who survived the Holocaust and settled locally. There's Steve Adler right there. I'll show you him in a moment. There's Noemi, we saw her. That's Noemi and her little sister. And on and on. So students basically already, and continue then, they can pick any one of these survivors, or I know I used to say, I want you to look at least 3 or 5 of them or something, and then pick the one that sticks out to you, pick the one that you feel a connection with. Because I always found that students do better when they have choice, obviously. And so by choosing which survivor and which part of the story, then it gets better buy-in and better connectivity. And so, okay, so let's take a look quickly at the top here at Steve Adler. And so this is what a student will see, hopefully. Okay, it's working. All right, so Steve Adler, he was an invaluable member of our Speakers Bureau for years, and gratefully, his daughter Barbara now goes into schools as a member of our as a member of our Speakers Bureau. Now she goes and tells the story of Steve and his experiences, and it's been tremendously positive and powerful for students in classrooms that have been fortunate enough to have her there. So you can see here that there's usually about 3-4 paragraphs of Steve's story with various links to things so that students could understand a little bit more about things he's talking about. Each of them have usually about 3 video clips, and then there would be full testimony or transcripts for the clips, and then various artifacts. And so let's say I had looked at 3 or 4 or 5 of these survivors, and let's say, you know what, the story of Steve really moves me, or I have a connection with this because Steve, as you had found out, he went on the Kindertransport, and he was sent away from his family into a country where he didn't know the language. He went to England, and he stayed there for a very long time and was able to obviously survive. And fortunately, in his case, his parents survived as well, and they were reunited. But that was a very unique story in terms of his family coming through this. But again, so student picks him then, and then says, okay, this is going to be the base of my project. And they go in, and then they follow what they need. So hopefully that's good. And again, there at the very bottom of the screen, I know that you can click questions in case anyone has questions. I definitely already have several, and I will try to respond to them with our time towards the end. Okay, so now coming back here, let me see. Okay, so now coming back to this slide here, now that we truly have, when they get into the writing and art contest, you truly not only have built again on the translating statistics into people, but at this point it allows for student voice. I've been, really blessed and fortunate enough to have had many student winners over the past several years while I was a teacher here in Washington State. And even for the kids who don't win, I know it's sort of, I know it's sort of, I don't know, cliche to say that everybody's a winner and things like that, but kids really, this has been invaluable to them. And by the time that you can connect it maybe into survivor testimony and things like that, these lessons will endure and they'll stay with them forever. They never forget this stuff. Okay. So I want to quickly go over a couple of additional learning resources and programs that we have. So I'll click this link here. And the first one, I guess I can talk about right here. All right, there we go. We just launched this program. This is a brand new program called Book by Book. And so in this program here, incredibly through the generosity of some of our donors, we were able to get 100 copies, I think 50 copies each of these two books here, White Bird by R.J. Palacio, which is the author, who is the author of Wonder. And it's considered a wonder story. It's a tremendous graphic novel that I think is accessible, probably grades 6 and up, I'm thinking. And it's really powerful, and apparently a character from the book Wonder, Julian, is the sort of introductory person. Then he's talking on the phone to his French grandmother, and he learns his grandmother's Holocaust story for the first time. And it's really, really good. I recommend it highly. And then the other one that I can't recommend highly enough is the graphic novel of Anne Frank's diary. This just came out last year, and it is so good. So students who were lucky enough to be among the first 100 to reserve copies of this book, they will also get teaching guides or discussion guides that will go along with those. And certainly for any teachers as well that are interested in what guides we're going to be using with those books, please feel free to shoot over an email and we can get you that. Then in addition to that, we have these virtual lunch and learns. Last week, we had our first virtual lunch and learn, and these are members of our Speakers Legacy program. They are the children, or in some cases, grandchildren of some of our survivors or rescuers. And this week's will be Naomi Newman, and she's going to talk about the story of her parents, who both were survivors in the Holocaust, and that's going to be tomorrow from 12 to 1. And last week we had Arik Cohen talking about the incredible odds of how all 4 of his grandparents were survivors. And we had about 200 people, including teachers and many, many students actually attend that lunch and learn. So it's a real great option for you. And then one other thing, if your students are looking for something to do or need something to do, we have a student book club. There will be a virtual meeting on April 23rd, and the book is actually a book that I wrote, in fact, about a local survivor. In fact, it was my first year when I was teaching in Spokane, and in that first year, the survivor that agreed to come out to Spokane to speak to my students, his name was Robert Holzer. And I became friends with Robert over the years, and I wrote his story, and it's an unbelievable story, a unique story of a Jew in hiding in Budapest. And it's a very unique facet of the history of the Holocaust to learn that. So anyone who's interested in that, either as a teacher or for your students, there are links to purchase the book if they click that link there. But in addition, we can also send them a free PDF of the book. Okay, so hopefully that helps. All right, so now let's see, get back into there. Okay, all right, so what I wanted to, sorry. Okay, so what I wanted at this point here, hopefully that's sort of an introduction to most of the things we have. So before I get the questions, I really think that it all comes down to this. So I want you to see Steve Adler's testimony here. The last link on our page of our virtual lessons includes enduring considerations and lessons of the Holocaust. And this is Steve Adler speaking here.
So Steve, here's my question for you. What advice do you have for young people today?
I would say respect people who are different, because almost everyone is different from you. And when someone doesn't show that respect by saying something negative, defend the person who is being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
That's bullying, and we need to do away with it. I think that does the job.
Okay, so I just want to, just to build upon, what Steve mentioned there, because
Hi, I'm Rex
Oh, sorry.
Moore with the
Oh, my
Motley
gosh.
Fool in front of BMW's self-driving exhibit at CES in Las Vegas. Now, do you
oh
have
boy.
I'm here with Hans Vestberg, CEO of Verizon. Hans, nice to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking the time to speak with us. So I want to ask you, during this crisis, Hans, how do you allocate time and resources between, on the one hand, doing the right
Hold
thing
on
for
a
your
second. I'm so
employees,
sorry.
keeping them busy and working and keeping their jobs, quite honestly, and on the other hand, Wall Street and
Okay, so I got that off. I'm so sorry. All right, so I wanted to say one last thing, I guess, to build on what Steve was just talking about. I think now more than ever, we see so many instances of, even before this whole crisis, of hate and people saying terrible things and blaming Asians for this and that. And I mean, just driving around on the rare moments of time when I get out of the house, it seems like people are so irascible at this time. And I think, going back to why we're here and the purpose of this education, not only as educators, but as people, this is about humanity. And Steve talks about it, any survivor talks about it, that they just want to promote kindness and empathy and understanding. And it's at the heart and soul of what the Holocaust Center is about and what it is and what we try to do. And I think we all need more of that. So cherishing time with your family. I mean, of course, all of this stinks and all of this is not the optimal circumstances we'd like to be in. But the hope is that we can rise up and that we can say on the other side of this, on the other end of this, these are the things that we did, and we loved one another, and we were kind, and we helped our students find light in this darkness, to use an adage. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so lastly then, it's I can take some of your questions here. First of all, I want to say that we have I'm blessed truly to work with the most amazing staff in my education department. Alana Cohn-Kennedy in the upper right there is our director of education, and she's an inspiration and so positive every single day in the things that she's done for people, let alone for what the center does. Julia Thompson is our education resources coordinator, and she is the personification of grace and knowledge, and she does such a wonderful job with our speakers bureau and organizing field trips and with virtually all of the resources that our center has. And then our amazing Rosie Campos, she is El Corazon of the center. She is our education assistant and program coordinator. So a couple questions that I have up here right now. I guess one of them is, what books can I use? What books do you recommend? It depends obviously on grade level. I'm a huge proponent of graphic novels. Why? Because I saw them work so well with students regardless of their reading level. Where I taught most recently in Kent, I had numerous refugees and immigrants, English language learners, and I had very high, level, highly capable students. And so using books like, using graphic novels, for example, like Mouse, which I think is so incredible in its historical accuracy and giving the entire sort of story from beginning to liberation into contemporary issues. I think Mouse is an incredible teaching vehicle, certainly for high school, and it's possible with, depending on your level of knowledge and comfort, and certainly we can provide support and teaching guides for you. It's possible also to do in middle school, but please talk to us before that. It would be hard to just assign this virtually, but it's an incredible book, and I've seen it work with, it's helped transform the most reluctant readers into the most engaged readers. Then, of course, like I say, I can't speak highly enough about the Anne Frank book here, the graphic novel. This, through the pictures it uses, the images, and using her actual diary, the language and the words in her diary, it's an amazingly powerful thing. I know that if I was in the classroom this year, I would probably use this at least for a group of my students, even as opposed to the play, which has some inaccuracies in it, or the full text, which is often a little bit too cumbersome for many readers, especially if they're not higher level readers. Then, as I mentioned before, White Bird, like I said, I talked about that, and the artwork is beautiful in it. It's a tremendous book, tremendous story. Another question I saw is, oh, hang on, there's another question related to the issue about what books. And the question is about historical fiction. My kids are reading Night, but I'd also like them to read some of When the Emperor Was Divine to show the Japanese experience. Personally, I think there's nothing wrong at all with historical fiction. I think, geez, I mean, off the top of my head, I think The Book Thief, though not a Holocaust book per se, it's one of my favorite books of all time, and it certainly has lessons of the Holocaust and facets of the Holocaust in there, and it is truly just a dance of figurative language. There is some historical fiction, though. See, the problem is with it is the issue of what is, the inaccuracies. For example, Boy in the Striped Pajamas, Holocaust educators really do not recommend that at all, for the reason not only that it's filled with numerous inaccuracies, but above and beyond that, I think reading or using that book at the heart of a Holocaust unit, it creates a false empathy with the perpetrator as opposed to the victim. So though a highly engaging book, and I like it myself, I would not use it even in a lit circle capacity, unless it was something after they had already read something like you said, Night or Mouse in particular, where they've learned enough about it that they would better understand the fact that this is a different story. Any other specific questions on the issue of books, you can feel free to email Ilana, me, really any of us here at the center, and I could provide you a list of recommendations. On the Japanese internment issue, there's some great ones, including actually a recent graphic novel by George Takei, the Star Trek guy. He wrote one that just came out last year, so maybe you could use that to complement your lesson. Then one other question I saw was, are you worried that, or do you have concerns about teaching these lessons during such a already volatile, sensitive time? And I think that's a great question. I think, again, you know your students best. I think it possibly depends on, were you already in the middle of your unit where kids understood and sort of got the idea of what this is and where this is going? Or have you not started it? So that might play into whether I would, or how much I would delve into it at this point. But again, knowing that there's a chance that you might not actually see face-to-face your students again before the end of the year, I know that I would want them to come away with something. And I think using this as a platform to get my kids into critical thinking and to contending with issues that were not only history, but are alive sadly today, and then getting them to stand up by participation in the contest, I think that would be a wonderful climactic thing that at the end of the day, you could hang your hat on it and say, yeah, this was great that I had my students get into this year. So I think, unless there are any other questions, I think that's, let's see, there's another one here. Do the Speakers Bureau Lunch and Learn videos on Tuesdays get recorded for students to watch later? Yes. they do get recorded. If you need any help finding that, please let me know. Let us know and we'll make sure we can get you links, but they are recorded. So Arik's last week was recorded. And that's another thing like you perhaps are getting into is the idea that those can be shared then. Those can be shared then. Maybe you could broadcast it to your class and say, I'd like everyone to watch this and then have a discussion after it. What else? Let's see. Yeah, someone just mentioned they called us enemy for Japanese internment. That's the George Takei graphic novel. I think that's really great, really great. So I think that's about it. So again, I hope, oh yeah, so I know I was reminded of this, is you need to, in order to get your clock hour here, just please, you will get an email actually from Julia of our center, and she will provide you the form or the link to complete, and that way you can get your clock hour. Any other specific questions at all relative to anything that I mentioned or things that I can help you with, or that's why I'm here. And I truly have more time on my hands now than I would even ordinarily when I'd be out there meeting with districts and talking to them, from everything from professional development to curriculum adaptation and modifications. So this is what I love to do. This is why I'm here, and I'd love to help you. So thank you again so much, everybody, for being here. And I look forward to working with you and building on whatever you're working with. Just simply ask. Thank you again.